It's great to see you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And the line we just heard, Jesus died for somebody's sins but not mine, is probably the one most people associate with you, at least in the early days. Were you surprised by how shocked people were?
Yes, I was. I wrote that line in a poem when I was 20, and I wrote it really in response to not so much to Jesus Christ, who I believe is a great revolutionary and a great teacher, but to the way in which organized religion portrayed him and continues to portray him. And so I was struggling with that issue, but also the whole song was really a declaration of existence, and I felt that people really didn't understand what I was saying. I was not saying anything against Christ, the teacher, and a spiritual leader, but for myself as a young person, declaring my existence and taking responsibility for the things that I did.
Well, your music and poetry are filled with references to God. Did you grow up in a religious home?
Yes, I did. I was brought up Jehovah's Witness, and my father had no particular religion. He studied all religions. So as I was raised in one religion, I was also educated in various religions. So
is that what you've done with your kids as well?
I've left things more open for them to choose. I haven't given them a religious education in terms of church. I've given them an education in understanding our holy books of all faiths and being respectful to everyone's faith.
Now, I mentioned that there's the new CD set, and there's also the first poetry collection in 10 years. Your whole life has been a kind of a balancing act between the poetry and the music, although maybe you don't make all that much of a distinction.
Well, I actually do. The music that I do, the songs that I do, which I work just as hard on, but they're collaborative. And when I write songs, I'm collaborating with musicians, usually someone like Lenny Kaye. I've collaborated with Tom Verlaine, Oliver Ray, but and when I'm writing songs, I'm really writing to communicate with as many people as possible. Songs are for the people, and when I'm writing poetry, it's quite a bit more personal and solitary.
The new book is called Auguries of Innocence, and the first in 10 years. Why has it taken you so long? Have you been writing poems all along?
Well, I'm always writing poetry, but it's I had a lot of things to struggle with in the last 10 years. You know, the death of my husband and my brother, my parents and my friends, and
Robert Mapplethorpe, for example.
And yes, of course. And I needed time to think about it and to be able to say the things that I wanted to say about these things with just the right words. But I have a lot of unpublished poetry. I just decided to put these poems together.
Doesn't the title Auguries of Innocence come from William Blake?
Yes, it does.
I'm assuming he's one of your favorites. What about his paintings and drawings? Because you also have a third career that we should mention. You've been associated with the Robert Miller Gallery since 1978, haven't you?
Yes.
Exhibit there regularly?
Yes, and I recently had a very large exhibit at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, a retrospective that's gone, in museums throughout the world. But I always loved William Blake because as a child I was introduced to his work by my mother. She gave me Songs of Innocence, and from Songs of Innocence, since he illustrated them too, I understood that one man could write songs and poems, paint, and also he was an activist. A lot of the songs and Songs of Innocence protest child labor, do sing of the abandoned child and the child who has enforced labor as chimney sweeps in mills. So I learned that, one person could express himself in various mediums, and I think this was a very big influence on me.
He also wrote a lot about religion. So you were painting and writing at the same time, but then the music sort of happened, didn't it? You were reading your poetry in downtown clubs, and then Lenny Kaye started playing electric guitar behind you. Was that just, hey, why don't you come by and we'll do something like jazz and poetry?
Well, I had gotten a lot of my poetic education not only from reading but from great poets like Gregory Corso, and Gregory would take me to poetry readings very early 70s, and he was always dismayed by how boring they were. And when I got to do my own poetry reading, I thought, well, I'm going to make certain that my readings are not boring, and I wanted to infuse some new life into reading poetry. So I had met Lenny Kaye and asked him to supply some interpretive guitar with some of the poems. And so Lenny and I evolved together and trying to make we had two parallel missions. One was to infuse more energy into poetry, and the other was to eventually remind people of the grassroots strength of rock and roll, which, of course, is political and poetic, revolutionary and sexual, and that it shouldn't be some big corporate, career and lifestyle motivated medium.
So when did you suddenly find yourself singing the lyrics instead of reading the
Well,
lyrics? In those days, I remember it was kind of like the Kenneth Koch flat delivery style.
Well, I always sang a little from my first reading in 71 because I came from South Jersey, and I grew up in the late 50s, early 60s, where an a cappella music was strong, and we all sang. We all sang on street corners, and so sort of sing-songing things was very familiar. In my very first poetry reading, I also sang Annie Had a Baby.
Can't Work No More.
And
Moonlighters.
and a Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Weill song, and also something that Lenny Kaye and I wrote. So it just happened organically. I have never considered myself much of a singer, but it was just the poems orally just evolved like that, because also people like Allen Ginsberg, Vachel Lindsay, Arthur Brown Jr., Oscar Brown Jr., a lot of the people that I saw, the beat poets, were not afraid to just lapse into, a little song. So I had no fear as well.